Let's be honest from the start. If you feel lost, stuck, or confused about your direction in life, there's a strong chance you're not actually lost. You're avoiding responsibility, not because you're weak, but because responsibility is uncomfortable. It demands effort, discipline, and the willingness to face your own role in where you are right now. This isn't about blame, it's about power. The moment you accept responsibility is the moment your life stops drifting and starts moving with intent. Clarity does not arrive as a sudden realization or a perfectly formed vision of the future. It is not something you discover by waiting, overthinking, or consuming more advice. Clarity is the result of ownership. When you take responsibility for where you are, without softening the truth or blaming external conditions, your thinking begins to sharpen. The mind stops spinning in vague confusion and starts organizing itself around what can actually be done. Ownership forces you to confront facts instead of fantasies, and facts have structure. Once you accept that your current situation is largely shaped by your past decisions, your attention naturally shifts from, "Why is this happening to me?" toward, "What am I going to do about it?" That shift alone eliminates much of the mental noise people mistake for being lost. Most people believe they need clarity before they act, but in reality, action creates clarity. Ownership demands action, even when the outcome is uncertain. When you take responsibility, you stop waiting for motivation, permission, or confidence to appear. You begin making small, concrete decisions and living with their consequences. Each decision, whether it works or not, provides feedback. That feedback is what sharpens direction. Without ownership, feedback is ignored or blamed on circumstances. With ownership, feedback becomes information. Over time, patterns emerge. You start to see what strengthens you, what drains you, what habits support progress, and which ones keep you stuck. That understanding does not come from thinking harder. It comes from being accountable for your choices. Ownership also removes the false comfort of confusion. Saying you are unsure, overwhelmed, or lost can feel honest, but often it is a way to delay responsibility. Confusion becomes a shield against commitment. When you take ownership, that shield disappears. You are forced to admit what you already know at a basic level. Certain actions move your life forward, and certain behaviors keep you exactly where you are. This realization can be uncomfortable because it removes excuses, but it is also empowering because it returns control to you. Once control is back in your hands, clarity is no longer something you chase. It is something that forms as you act consistently and observe the results. As ownership deepens, your priorities begin to reorder themselves. You become less interested in dramatic changes and more focused on sustainable ones. You stop asking abstract questions about purpose and start addressing practical responsibilities: how you manage your time, your energy, your health, and your commitments. Each area you take responsibility for becomes more stable, and stability creates mental space. In that space, direction becomes clearer, not because life has become simple, but because you are no longer avoiding the weight of your own agency. Discipline is often misunderstood as something you either have or you do not, as if it were a fixed personality trait reserved for a certain type of person. That belief is convenient because it allows people to excuse inconsistency by saying it simply is not who they are. In reality, discipline is a practice, repeated daily through ordinary decisions that rarely feel impressive. It is not about intensity, extremes, or constant self-control. It is about structure. When your days have structure, your emotions have less power over your actions. You stop negotiating with yourself every morning and start operating from routines that remove friction. Over time, these routines shape behavior, and behavior shapes identity, not the other way around. Daily discipline works because it reduces dependence on motivation. Motivation is unreliable, influenced by mood, energy, and external circumstances. Discipline, practiced daily, functions regardless of how you feel. It shows up in the smallest choices: getting up when the alarm goes off, completing tasks you committed to, managing your time with intention instead of reaction. These actions are not dramatic, but they are decisive. Each time you follow through, you reinforce the idea that your word matters. Each time you break a commitment to yourself, you weaken that internal trust. Discipline rebuilds that trust slowly, through repetition, not through sudden transformation. This practice also teaches emotional regulation. Daily discipline requires acting even when boredom, frustration, or doubt appear. Instead of avoiding discomfort, you learn to move through it without making it personal. You stop interpreting resistance as a sign that something is wrong and start seeing it as part of the process. This shift is critical because most long-term goals are not difficult because they are complex, but because they require sustained effort in the absence of immediate reward. Discipline trains you to accept delayed outcomes without quitting or constantly changing direction. Over time, discipline simplifies decision-making. When your actions are guided by established practices, you are less likely to waste mental energy on choices that do not matter. You know when you work, when you rest, and what standards you hold yourself to. This consistency reduces stress and increases clarity because your life stops feeling reactive. The idea that disciplined people are naturally disciplined is a misunderstanding. They are not driven by personality. They are supported by systems. They practice discipline when it is easy and when it is inconvenient, allowing consistency to carry them forward even on days when effort feels heavy. Discomfort is often treated as a warning sign, something to avoid or eliminate as quickly as possible. But in reality, it is the price paid for any form of meaningful growth. Progress requires leaving familiar patterns, and familiarity, even when harmful, feels safe. When you step outside those patterns, your mind reacts with resistance. That resistance is not a signal that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something new. Growth challenges the body and the mind to adapt, and adaptation is never comfortable. Expecting progress without discomfort creates unrealistic expectations that cause people to quit the moment things feel difficult. Most people delay growth not because they lack ability, but because they misinterpret discomfort as danger. Physical fatigue, mental strain, uncertainty, and self-doubt are treated as problems to solve rather than experiences to endure. The moment discomfort appears, they retreat to what is easy and familiar, reinforcing the very patterns they claim to want to escape. Discomfort becomes something to escape instead of something to tolerate. But the ability to tolerate discomfort is what separates temporary effort from lasting change. When you learn to stay present through discomfort without immediately seeking relief, you gain control over your reactions, and that control compounds over time. Discomfort also exposes weakness honestly. When things are easy, it is difficult to tell whether progress is real or superficial. Pressure reveals what habits are solid and which ones collapse. Mental discomfort reveals how quickly you look for distraction or justification. Physical discomfort reveals whether you stop at the first sign of strain or continue with intention. This exposure is uncomfortable because it removes self-deception. It shows you exactly where discipline is lacking and where excuses are hiding. While this can feel discouraging, it is actually useful information. You cannot strengthen what you refuse to examine. As discomfort becomes familiar, its emotional intensity decreases. You stop reacting to it as an emergency and start treating it as a normal part of effort. This shift changes how you approach challenges. Instead of asking how to avoid difficulty, you begin asking how to move through it efficiently. Confidence grows not from success alone, but from knowing you can endure strain without falling apart or abandoning your commitments. Over time, discomfort stops being an obstacle and becomes a signal that you are operating at the edge of your current capacity, where growth is most likely to occur. Self-control is often framed as restriction, as if it were about limiting enjoyment or denying yourself pleasure. But in reality, it is the foundation of freedom. Without self-control, your behavior is dictated by impulse, mood, and external influence. You react instead of choose. That may feel freeing in the short term, but over time it creates dependence, instability, and regret. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want in the moment. It is the ability to act in alignment with your long-term interests, even when short-term urges pull in the opposite direction. Self-control is what allows that alignment to exist. Physical self-control plays a critical role because the body shapes the mind. When sleep, movement, nutrition, and daily rhythms are unmanaged, mental clarity suffers. Fatigue lowers patience, increases emotional reactivity, and weakens judgment. In that state, even simple decisions feel overwhelming. By contrast, basic physical discipline creates stability. You are not constantly fighting your own body. Energy becomes predictable, focus improves, and decision-making becomes less chaotic. This is not about perfection or extreme routines, but about removing avoidable friction so your attention can be directed toward meaningful work instead of constant self-regulation. Mental self-control is equally important. Attention is one of the most valuable resources you have, and without control, it is easily fragmented. Constant stimulation, distraction, and information overload weaken your ability to think deeply or follow through on complex tasks. Self-control at the mental level means choosing what you engage with and for how long. It means resisting the urge to escape discomfort through distraction and instead staying with tasks long enough to complete them properly. Over time, this builds concentration and emotional steadiness, both of which are necessary for long-term progress. As self-control develops, options expand rather than shrink. When you are no longer governed by impulse, you gain flexibility. You can delay gratification without resentment. You can say no without feeling deprived. You can endure boredom or difficulty without needing immediate relief. This capacity creates independence. You are less vulnerable to manipulation, less reactive to circumstances, and less likely to sabotage your own goals. Freedom emerges not from the absence of limits, but from the ability to choose your limits intentionally and live within them with consistency. Self-control is often misunderstood as suppression, as if it requires constant force or denial, but in reality, it is the mechanism that allows choice to exist. Without self-control, behavior is shaped by whatever impulse is strongest in the moment, whether that impulse comes from stress, boredom, fear, or habit. Living this way may feel spontaneous, but it gradually narrows your options. Decisions become reactive, patterns repeat, and circumstances begin to dictate your life. Self-control interrupts that cycle by creating space between impulse and action, and in that space, freedom becomes possible. The body is where self-control is first tested. Sleep, movement, and basic physical care are not minor details. They directly affect emotional stability and cognitive function. When the body is neglected, mental discipline becomes significantly harder. Fatigue lowers resistance to distraction, increases irritability, and reduces patience. By maintaining simple physical standards, you reduce internal chaos. Energy becomes more reliable, moods stabilize, and the effort required to make good decisions decreases. This is not about strict routines or extreme control, but about consistency in fundamentals that support mental clarity rather than undermine it. Mental self-control is the ability to direct attention deliberately instead of allowing it to be constantly pulled outward. Modern environments reward distraction and immediate stimulation, making sustained focus increasingly difficult. Without control over attention, even meaningful goals feel overwhelming because the mind never stays with one task long enough to make progress. Self-control at this level means limiting unnecessary inputs, finishing what you start, and tolerating boredom or frustration without escaping into distraction. Over time, this strengthens concentration and builds confidence in your ability to manage yourself under pressure. As self-control develops, life becomes more flexible rather than more rigid. You gain the ability to delay gratification without feeling deprived and to endure discomfort without needing instant relief. Choices expand because you are no longer constrained by habits you did not consciously choose. You can respond thoughtfully instead of reacting automatically. This independence reduces anxiety because your sense of stability no longer depends entirely on external conditions. Freedom, in this sense, is not the absence of structure, but the presence of internal order that allows you to act intentionally regardless of circumstance. Identity is often treated as something you discover through introspection, but in reality, it is something you construct through repetition. What you do consistently shapes how you see yourself far more than what you intend or believe. Single actions have little impact, but repeated behaviors accumulate into patterns, and patterns form identity. When your actions align over time, they send a clear signal about who you are becoming. This process is slow and often unnoticed, which is why many people underestimate its power. They wait for confidence, clarity, or motivation to appear first, not realizing that those qualities emerge as a byproduct of consistent action. Consistency works because it removes the need for constant decision-making. When behavior becomes habitual, it no longer depends on mood or circumstance. You show up because that is what you do, not because you feel inspired. This reliability builds self-trust. Each time you follow through, you reinforce the belief that your word has value. Each time you abandon a commitment, you weaken that belief. Over time, these small moments of follow-through or avoidance quietly shape your internal narrative. You begin to see yourself either as someone who can be relied upon or someone who tends to drift when things become inconvenient. This process also explains why identity cannot be changed through declarations alone. Telling yourself you are disciplined, resilient, or focused does nothing unless your daily actions support that claim. The mind looks to evidence, not intention. Consistency provides that evidence. When you repeatedly act in a certain way, your self-image adjusts to match your behavior. This alignment reduces internal conflict. You stop feeling like you are forcing yourself to be someone you are not because your actions and identity begin to reinforce each other. Consistency does not require dramatic effort, but it does require patience. Results are often delayed, and the early stages can feel unrewarding. Progress may not be visible day to day, which tempts people to change direction or abandon the process altogether. However, identity is not built in moments of intensity. It is built in sustained repetition under ordinary conditions. Each day you maintain a standard, even when no one is watching and nothing feels exciting. You are reinforcing a version of yourself that becomes increasingly stable and difficult to break. Over time, consistency removes the need for motivation because behavior becomes automatic and identity becomes anchored in what you repeatedly prove to yourself through action. Truth-based improvement begins with honesty that is clear, direct, and uncomfortable. Not honesty meant to punish or shame, but honesty that refuses to distort reality for emotional convenience. Most people struggle not because they lack potential, but because they avoid accurate self-assessment. They soften facts, explain away patterns, or compare themselves to others in ways that protect their ego. This creates a false sense of progress while nothing fundamentally changes. Brutal honesty removes that distortion. It forces you to look at outcomes rather than intentions, and to measure your life by what is actually happening, not by what you hoped would happen. This level of honesty requires separating identity from behavior. When people feel attacked by their own shortcomings, they become defensive and stop learning. Truth-based improvement demands the opposite response. It requires acknowledging failure without turning it into a personal verdict. If a habit is not producing results, honesty means admitting it is not working. If effort has been inconsistent, honesty means naming that inconsistency without excuses. This clarity is uncomfortable because it eliminates stories that protect self-image. But without clarity, improvement becomes guesswork. You cannot correct what you refuse to define accurately. Brutal honesty also exposes patterns that are easy to ignore in daily life. Isolated mistakes can be dismissed, but repeated outcomes tell a different story. If deadlines are consistently missed, if health is steadily declining, or if goals are repeatedly postponed, these are not random events. They are signals. Truth-based improvement requires paying attention to these signals and taking responsibility for them. This does not mean assigning blame or dwelling on regret. It means recognizing cause and effect. Once cause and effect are clear, choices become clearer as well. As honesty deepens, it becomes a stabilizing force rather than a source of discomfort. You stop negotiating with yourself and start dealing in facts. Expectations become more realistic, and progress becomes measurable. This approach reduces frustration because energy is no longer wasted on self-deception. Instead of cycling between hope and disappointment, you work with what is real and adjust accordingly. Brutal honesty creates a foundation strong enough to support long-term change because it replaces vague ambition with precise understanding and replaces excuses with responsibility. The moment you stop avoiding responsibility is the moment you reclaim control over your life. Growth, clarity, and freedom all follow when you face reality honestly and act consistently. Nothing meaningful changes without effort, but every step you take with discipline and self-control builds the person you are capable of becoming. Your life moves forward the moment you decide to own it fully.